This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, thought, books, and ideas and Israel. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shandlin. I'm speaking to you today from London. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a subscriber by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find a link on the Tel Aviv Review website and in the show summary on your podcast app. Our guest today is Julia Ebner. She is a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where she's a researcher on terrorism and extremism. Before that, she worked for the world's first counter-extremism organization, Quilliam. She led research projects on terrorism prevention for the European Commission and has given evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee on Far-Right Extremism. We'll be talking about her new book, which was published in late 2017, entitled The Rage, The Vicious Circle of Islamist and Far-Right Extremism, published by IB Tauris, and we're going to be trying to get to the bottom of all the haters. Why do they actually do what they do? Why do they hate so much? And what can we do about it? Julia Ebner, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, I want to start by asking you about something in the opening of the book, and even actually it's the dedication. You dedicate the book to Joe Cox, the parliamentarian, of course, who was murdered in the run-up to the Brexit vote by a far-right extremist. This clearly had a major impact on you. So it made me kind of wonder, what was the greater impetus for you to write this book? Was it your research in Islamist extremism or far-right extremism? Was there one that sort of had that gave you the actual push to say, I have to get this material out there?
Yeah, to be honest, it was really the combination of both, because at the time when I started the research, I was working at Quilliam, I was mostly focusing on Islamist extremism. But when Joe Cox's murder happened and I looked deeper into the motivations and deeper into far-right extremism, I noticed so many overlaps in the strategies, but also in the goals of both forms of extremism. And then I became interested in what actually the interactions and this interplay between the two forms are. So that's where this reciprocal radicalization research started.
Yeah. So what are some of those things? I mean, this is really the whole theme of your book, but what are the main things that started to strike you that you said, actually, these two forms of extremism had a lot in common, even though we tend to study them separately or think about them separately?
Yeah, so at the heart of both ideologies and both worldviews was this idea that we were facing an imminent war or an ongoing war of races or cultures or religions. And in a way, because they both divided the world into Muslims and non-Muslims being in inherent conflict with each other, they were feeding off one another, and their strategies of polarizing our communities and driving apart Muslims and non-Muslims was really helping both sides to mobilize. So after every jihadist attack, we would see more far-right extremists or more people joining far-right movements. And on the other hand, even after every far-right incident, we'd see more Muslims joining Islamist extremist groups.
I have to say that I was going to save this question for the end, but in some ways you've already raised the point that they're working so much in reaction to each other. They're listening to each other. They're reading each other's material online. They're responding to what's the kind of things that one another are saying. It's almost like they live in a world of one another. This is something that one of the impressions that I got reading your book. Do you think that they sometimes focus inordinately on each other and kind of forget about the rest of us, the rest of the world, the more moderate people, conservatives or liberals, but just, normal people?
Yeah, absolutely. So in many ways, I think they're obsessed about the out-group, in-group thinking. And they also, in a way, want to get rid of the middle, want to get rid of any gray zone Muslims or any gray zone people who might not share their ideologies or not be their enemy, because their enemy is, of course, beneficial to them for their mobilization. But the people in the middle are actually the real problem.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it makes it sound like they're extremists for the sake of being extreme. What do they have against those middle people?
But the interesting thing is that they don't perceive themselves as extremists.
Okay.
So they would only see the other extreme as extreme. So anything that is not completely diametrically opposed to the other, to their enemy, essentially, would also be considered extreme or not legitimate.
So it's a whole different perception of what counts as extremism. I want to go back to this idea that both of them see themselves at war. In a way, again, reading your book, I sort of thought maybe Samuel Huntington was right all along. These people, both sides, agree that there is an apocalyptic war going on between Islamists and the West. That's how they seem to both perceive it. So can we just sort of close the door and say we know everything now, Huntington was right and that's all there is to it? I mean, I didn't think so at the time, I confess. I thought it was more complex than that. But
yeah, well, what's interesting is that it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what is starting from the fringes and is actually a conflict between, the extreme right and Islamists, who would both blur the lines between Islam and Islamism, who would both blur the lines between anti-Muslim segments of that exist in the West and the entire West, both paint each other as being inherently evil and opposed to one another. I think they mainstream these ideologies and bring it from the fringe into the mainstream, the more this clash of cultures or civilizations would turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in a way, we've entered a vicious circle that might turn Samuel Huntington's thesis into reality, but hopefully that won't be the case.
The other thing I think I wanted to ask is that, you talk about, I think you call it the age of rage, right? And you say that it's characterized, this age we live in now, by a vicious circle of emotionally driven actions and reactions. Okay, that's your quote. And then you also write that in our generation, we had an illusion of eternal peace. Now, we're not exactly of the same generation, I confess, but I have to say that my generation didn't have any illusion of eternal peace. And you walk through the history of the clashes of ideologies and the clashes of, secular ideologies and religious ideologies. And I think about, the Cold War and the proxy wars of the Cold War, the first waves of terrorism in the 1970s, when I think people felt like the world was collapsing, right down to the end of communism and the post-communist nationalist wars. And I mean, are we really going through a particular phase of rage, or are we just a race of rage?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I agree with you that it also very much depends, of course, also on the context that we grew up in. But I'm under the impression that it's especially now Generation Z, so really the generation after the millennials that grew up with that context of the war, the global war on terror after 9/11. And that's really the generation that is being targeted the most now by both sides, by both the far-right extremists and the jihadists, because, ISIS, the average age was, of course, between 18 and 24 for the foreign fighters. But then also, for example, the founder of the biggest neo-Nazi webpage, Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin, he also said that Generation Z, he even called the generation Zyklon after the gas that was used in the gas chambers, Zyklon B, and which is, he calls them Generation Zyklon because he thinks they're most susceptible to his neo-Nazi ideologies.
Yeah, and when you say, I want to clarify, when you say targeting, both sides are targeting, that you mean targeting for recruitment.
Exactly, targeting for recruitment, because they both think that they're the most susceptible to their ideologies, which in a way is also showing that this really youngest generation is completely, in a way also, I think, more receptive and differs really from the previous generations, because they grew up with this idea of a war between cultures or between religions, between the West and Islam.
I'm not totally convinced, only because, I grew up, sort of at the peak years of communist paranoia, I think, in the 1980s, when we all thought the other side was going to use a nuclear bomb against us. We were, kind of taught the other side was evil. But let's say there's certainly new and different forms now. What I think is also interesting about the way you tell this story is that you tell it as a story of stories. You argue that both sides have told stories about who they are and why they're at war, and, the long existential history of these, that's led us to this point of an existential war. Can you tell us something about the stories that maybe characterizes both sides? And then I will ask you about the specific stories of the Muslim extremist, the Islamist, I should say, and the far-right extremist. But let's think about what characterizes those stories, other than the fact that we know that there's some sort of an apocalyptic war.
Yeah, well, actually also this question is, I think, linked, the importance of the stories and of shared grievances and shared negative experiences, I think is also linked to the previous question of what's different now from back then, from during the Cold War. I think it's really that dimension of course, social media and new technologies that allow for actually sharing these these individual stories on a global level. And that's something where when monitoring both the, for example, neo-Nazi chat groups, but also the ISIS, pro-ISIS chat groups, this recurring narrative, victimhood narrative that is then tied to a bigger meta-narrative of the West and the war being at war with each other is something that I found on both sides. And for example, some of these narratives would be coming from various corners of the world. So some of them would share stories of the oppression of Muslims in Kashmir, would link that to Palestine, would link that to the burqa ban in France, would link that to some other forms of discrimination they experienced in the States, and also the racial tensions in the States. But
and they're telling their personal stories because they have that platform?
Yeah, exactly. So they're telling their personal story, but then it's all linked to this perceived global oppression of Muslims. And then, of course, there are added layers of conspiracy theories, where then also the anti-establishment sentiment begins, and where then anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are shared on top of that. And the same is true for the far-right extremists, where they would also share stories of, for example, Swedish girls being raped by immigrants in Germany, Muslim immigrants being convicted of some form of violence, then terrorist attacks happening in France. And they would tie together all of these stories and say, well, that's because we're facing an invasion from Muslims, from Muslim immigrants. And that is actually also then from many of their perspectives also orchestrated by what they would call the global Jewish elites.
So they really got every kind of hatred in there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also where they overlap, because they would both have these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories at the end of the day, which they link the whole narrative to.
So it really is all the fault of the Jews. I mean, in a way, that's the one thing they agree on.
That is one of the elements they agree on.
But I really did not intend for this to be a discussion about that, because in fact, I would say the issue of anti-Semitism and historic anti-Semitism is only a small part of your book in a way. It's only a small part of the analysis. Is that fair to say?
That's true, because it's mostly about this perceived conflict between Islam and the West.
Right. And the other thing I think was interesting, and you point this out also about the things they have in common, is that in both of their stories about the sense of victimhood and being threatened, there's a strong element of it's the women being threatened, where they both focus on the threat to our women, but yet both far-right extremists in the West and Islamicists are not exactly known for promoting, the empowerment of women. So it's an interesting, I understand it, of course, but I would love for you to elaborate on why so much of that narrative focuses on women.
At first sight, it seems really paradox, I agree. And especially when I went to some of the events organized by the Islamists and by the far-right, it was really interesting to see how, on the one hand, as you said, really regressive their views were towards the role of women, the even family systems, and how misogynic on both sides some of the elements, the ideological elements were. But at the same time, they also view women as crucial to their future, their vision of creating ethno-culturally homogeneous society, and where the women become, of course, on the one hand, important for the next generations, for bringing about that state or that form of society that they hope for, and in a way become a possession that they have to protect. But on the other hand, I think they're also often used as propaganda tools on both sides. They're really instrumentalized in many ways on both sides.
It's interesting. So in the end, you're saying it really doesn't have to do with the women. It has to do with what they think will help to recruit men to become better soldiers in the war, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. That was reflected in some of the ISIS propaganda, of course, where they used even some of the 15, 16-year-old Austrian girls, for example, as poster girls in a way to lure more young male fighters into their circles. And on the other hand, other far-right extremist movements do the same. They would also use pretty women for their propaganda to target often also men who are in some form of masculinity crisis. I think that's really something we found also at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in our research, is that often right now, both in Europe, in the US, but also in the Middle East and North Africa, to a certain extent, there is a masculinity crisis that is often being exploited by both the jihadists and, for example, the alt-right.
Well, that's very interesting. I was going to ask you actually about the psychological profile. I can't help it. We're in the world of Cambridge Analytica, and this is the story now. I was going to ask you about whether there is something you can identify about the kind of people who join, who are recruited, who allow themselves to be recruited, that's working. But you're already kind of pointing out something about their psychological makeup, that there is some sort of a masculinity crisis. Where does that come from, that particular masculinity crisis? And then do you see any other personal psychological characteristics that leave people vulnerable?
Well, the masculinity crisis is really something where we think it also kind of became a bigger issue because of the really rapidly changing notions of masculinity, of what it means to be a white man on the one hand in Europe, in the US, in the West, but also what it means to be a man in the Middle East and in North Africa. Even that has changed quite a lot within the last decades. And I think it's really something where we also see that acceleration of where the democratization of knowledge, of information, also the empowerment of women through new technologies, through that democratization of knowledge has really driven some of really profound, maybe latently present grievances that were latently present before, but that really are resurfacing right now among young men, especially.
It's so interesting. So first we thought that basically it's all about the Jews, right? They both blame the Jews. Now I think it's all the women's fault. In other words, because feminism came around and the structures of society have changed in the West, it's not completed, of course, but what you're saying in a way is that all these people suddenly can't cope after several decades already of women's status changing in society and the change in the status of the family and their own role in the West and also, in the Middle East. And that's giving them a crisis because they're not sure about where their power lies, and that threatens their masculinity on a deep collective level.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's one of the recurring patterns that we see. But as you said there, it's really hard to paint a clear psychological profile for people who are vulnerable to radicalization because they're often coming from very different, really diverse social backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, educational backgrounds. We've had, especially on the foreign fighters side, but also on for some of the extreme right movements, we've had highly educated individuals that were radicalized rapidly because they were reading so much and actually consuming so much of that radicalizing literature that they even walked down that pathway even quicker than some of the. So
by contrast to our stereotype of people who are just sort of downtrodden and ignorant.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why they become radicalized. You're saying it's people who are
in
educated.
A way that accelerated the process in some of the cases. But I think what we really noticed was that, of course, there are patterns in the behavior, and that's really where it's worth identifying some of the early warning signs that are shown more in the behavior patterns, both online but also offline. And that's what we do in the prevention work. We try to spot these signs of radicalization rather than painting psychological profiles for people.
So you don't think Cambridge Analytica works either. What are some of those signs? She's agreeing with me. I want listeners to know. What are some of the signs that you look for online in terms of online behavior that indicates that sort of radicalization?
There's language shifts and shifts in the consumption of media. And, well, in general, I think that's really strong changes in the consumption of the media sources. They would look at the literature, they would search for, in general, keywords. People would search for, especially also some of the language and the code words that are sometimes being used. And of course, joining certain groups or certain networks is always a sign.
And just so I understand the work of Quilliam and the Institute here, do you try to sort of publish those indicators so that people around can kind of take a look at their loved ones and their kids and know what they're doing so they know what to look for?
Yeah, so we're taking two approaches to this. On the one hand, we just recently published a report about our one-to-one interventions work, which is actually identifying people who are showing signs of radicalization, especially in the digital space. And on the other hand, we're also regularly publishing and in general also providing workshops or training for people, both for young people, for families, for frontline practitioners, anyone who would have who would be able to spot signs in their surroundings for radicalization.
I just wanted to get that in there because it's interesting. You actually you see yourselves as having an active public role in this issue. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the sort of the internal stories and developments within both sides of this equation that we're looking at, the extreme Islamicists and the far right extremists. You made me start to think about the question of fundamentalism. And I guess I was focusing just on a very specific issue about when modern Islamic extremism began to sort of read back into its roots different meanings. And you mentioned particularly Ibn Taymiyyah, who claimed that, quote, jihad was obligatory to all Muslims to rescue Islam from the confines of jahiliyyah, meaning ignorance. And you say this was revolutionary because it was the first time somebody had mandated lethal force against Muslims. But I want to ask, when did that become the exclusive interpretation of the word jihad? I mean, isn't that a sort of, I think that I've heard some people protest the use of the word fundamentalism, but there is something about rereading new meanings into very old concepts that leads to this extremism. Can you help me elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest problems is the principle of abrogation that Islamist extremist groups use for reading the Quran, essentially, for kind of prioritizing some of the verses within the Quran that would call for violence, that would be explicitly about those violent parts, and prioritizing those that are standing in rather for solidarity, for peaceful coexistence. And I think that is really what ISIS has been using, and in general using the interpretations that were given by some of the Islamist ideologues that also inspired Al-Qaeda, that inspired in a way jihadism in the 20th century. That is really something where both the far right and the Islamist extremists have an interest in spreading that form of that interpretation of Islam, that interpretation of the Quran, where they blur the lines between what's actually Islam, what is Islamist extremism, or what is Islamism.
Right. I just want to ask you also methodologically, how did you study this? I mean, you talk about a lot of experiences in the book where you really put yourself in the middle of it. This goes for both communities. But here there's also a language barrier, or which languages did you speak? How did you track this stuff on social media? And what are some of your personal experiences getting into that, serious Islamist community?
Yeah. So there were, on the one hand, I had my colleagues at Quilliam some of them came from Islamist networks, so they were former extremists and still had, of course, access to many of the documents, to the networks that I could consult. And we have quite a big network of former extremists, but then I also wanted to really go into some of the networks and speak directly to the people involved on both sides. And I was doing that online and offline. So online, I would monitor pro-ISIS chat groups, mostly the European language ones. I had a bit of help for the Arabic-speaking ones, but I personally watched most closely the European and American ones, so the French, German, English-speaking ones.
So these are happening in French and in German and English. They're having these radicalization conversations.
Absolutely, sometimes even bilingual. So there are also German, English bilingual chats of, most of the time, people who are now who have returned now and are thinking about a cyber caliphate, for example.
A cyber caliphate. Maybe I'd prefer to have a cyber caliphate than a physical one. What do you think? Or maybe you don't agree. Maybe you think it's more dangerous.
Well, in many ways, it could be more dangerous because they're making plans for committing hacking attacks. But I mean, right now, their capabilities aren't there yet. But it is still, I think it might even be a more concerning thought than actually having.
I'm convinced. That's bad too. Let me ask you also about the far right. When I was reading that chapter about sort of going through the story of the far right, which is, again, both sides, you sort of tell this long historic story. I got the feeling that it's not quite as ancient and theological, but that it emerged more out of modern grievances. Am I right or wrong about that? And I also felt that it was a little bit more scattered. It had a lot of things going on in there. It wasn't quite the same linear structure as the Muslim theological interpretation that has led to the Islamic extremism. What do you think?
Yeah, there are definitely elements that date back to hundreds of years, especially for some of the conspiracy theories used on the extreme right side. But then I agree that there is definitely also a rebranding happening. There's a new far right that emerged only in the 21st century, really.
So even different from 20th century.
Yeah.
In what way does it differ?
In a way, they've been looking a lot more at optics. They've been really trying to distance themselves from the traditional kind of neo-Nazis, from using also a socially more acceptable rhetoric, but essentially also painting entire communities as evil and doing a lot of it behind jokes, transgression, using memes or things that would make their ideologies appear less malign or appear more socially digestible for the public and trying to appeal really to the mainstream. I think that's one of the major differences.
In a way, that's a little bit scary because they're sort of trying to make themselves seem a little bit more acceptable, and maybe they'll be more successful that way.
Yeah, and many of them have been successful also in using some of the more moderate mouthpieces, some of the really extreme, coming from the very extreme side of the far right. They've been successful in using some of the more moderate ones as their mouthpieces to spread and strategically kind of inject their extreme ideologies into the mainstream. And that's one of the major dangers. But I agree that there's also been more of the landscape on the far right side is a lot more divided and splintered into different subcultures, subgroups with different sets of ideologies and different combinations. So it's not as coherent as on the Islamist side. Of course, Al-Qaeda and ISIS would also differ in some ways, but essentially they're not as far apart as some of the far-right extremist movements.
One stat that stuck out to me, because of course I'm originally American, is that 84 of 892 U.S. hate groups are located in Texas. I mean, not to malign the Texans, but how do you explain that? Is there some sort of an epidemiology to this? Do small groups affect physical communities in physical proximity?
Yeah, so that's one of the most interesting dynamics. I think that when I did the field studies, the field visits, I realized how often if there are lots of activities on one side of the extreme, you'd automatically, in many cases, also have a high rate of extremism on the other side. So there might be, that's what I call reciprocal radicalization hotbeds, because there's often an interaction that actually brings about more, that creates almost a reaction to some of the Islamist extremist groups in the area, or on the other hand, far-right extremist groups in the area. And in Luton or in places in the UK, there has been a similar dynamic. In Texas, on both the kind of more, some of the Islamist extremist groups have really formed in reaction to the presence of many far-right extremist groups, and vice versa. So it's always that acceleration of mutual hatred in a way, or that amplification of mutual hatred if there is a high concentration of one group or the other group.
I want to go back to another couple of points about what characterizes extremism and fundamentalism, because we've gone through kind of the separate manifestations. Well, a little bit. You have to read the book for the rest of it. But I also thought I observed a common tendency among them that I don't remember that you actually pointed out, but it emerges from your narrative, which is that the idea of attacking civilians, right, which both sides do, in a way, it characterizes this notion that my group is legitimized choosing any individual from the other collective. In other words, every individual of the other side is held responsible for this existential threat that each side experiences. And I feel like that distinguishes extremists from people who are either liberal or conservative or right or left, but they wouldn't take an individual and blame that individual for everything they think is wrong with the collective of whoever the other is. What do you think about that characterization?
Yeah, I agree. And I think in addition to that, there's also the dehumanization of the other that is distinguishing extremists from non-extremists, or from people we just might disagree with. I think this dehumanization that then justifies violence towards this really demonized out-group, and the victimization of the in-group, that's something that is really common among all forms of extremism.
Yeah, so from dislike to dehumanization.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we know all about that from the 20th century as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I mean, now on both the Islamist and the far-right extremist side, of course, there's also this anti-establishment sentiment that is kind of fueled. So it's not just
which really distinguishes
side,
it from fascism away, because it's so anti-state and anti-political system. How do you maybe that's what you were talking about when you mentioned also this 21st century version that is different from the 20th century?
Yeah, well, it's also because we see that small groups are empowered a lot more by the creation of global filter bubbles and echo chambers on the internet. They can join forces on an international level. So we've also been really at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, we've been doing lots of research on the international connectivity and sometimes opportunistic collaboration between groups across the world, where it just turns into a global echo chamber, and they're much more powerful. Even some of the fringe groups become more powerful, although they have essentially no voice on, for example, a political level.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So let's move. I mean, it's disturbing stuff. And I want to move into your last chapter, which really has to do with what we can do, what can be done about this. I mean, I would love to ask you just, what can be done. But I will say that on the way here to London, I just read a story in The Economist that mentioned a Pew survey showing that 1/4 of Muslims raised in America leave the faith. Now, they're talking about regular Muslims. It's just, people become less religious. We have, I don't know the numbers, but it happens in the Jewish community as well. What is the rate of, the dropout rate for extremists? Is there such a thing? Can you try to track that? And what do you think causes it?
Yeah, we've worked a lot, especially recently, with former extremists to do intervention work to really bring out some of the radicalized individuals from their networks, it could be any form of extremism, but we've really had very good rates, I think, for our last one-to-one engagement that was in the digital space, but that we had, I think, a rate of 20% of people leaving actually those networks. And that was
20% of people that you reached out to.
Exactly.
Not just 20% in general.
Not just 20% in general, but which is still quite a high rate. I mean, it is probably one of the hardest things to do, because you have to consider that those people who are embedded in those networks, not just is the ideology really, they've been indoctrinated in a way really deep inside, but also their social network is completely made up of extremists in many cases. So it's sometimes their families, their friends, which makes it even harder and a longer process to leave those extremist networks. And that's something I also learned from my former colleagues at Quilliam, that it does take quite a lot of courage, quite a lot of time to get out. But yeah, some of the intervention work that we've done had some really good success stories of people leaving, especially also when we were working with survivors of terrorist attacks, but also former extremists who would then reach out to individuals because they're in a way able to connect on a much deeper level and gain their trust.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I found it interesting that in that final chapter on what can be done, one of the points that you make is education. Now, this is intuitive, right? Because, I've spent lots of time in university, and we see how people in university become critical and they start questioning and they start, and many of them, I don't have a poll, but a lot of academics are more liberal leaning. Not all, I think it's overstated. But I tend to agree that education makes people realize there's always different stories and different narratives and different perspectives. Yet this sort of contradicts something you said in the beginning, which is that many of these people already are educated.
Yeah.
Well, how does education play in, for and against extremism?
Yeah, well, I think it's not just about the formal education level. I think what's often not really taught in schools is the most relevant part, actually, and that is digital citizenship, and digital literacy, but also critical thinking skills are often not dealt with enough. And especially when linking that to some of the really recent challenges that the internet brought about, that global echo chambers and new manipulation strategies and techniques that are used on social media, where bad actors essentially exploit some of the known bugs of these new media ecosystems, like algorithms, like echo chambers. And I think those issues would have to be addressed in a much more sophisticated way in schools, but also in informal education settings. And that's also why we do a lot of work producing awareness-raising campaigns, but also working with NGOs and frontline practitioners to help them teach young people, but also really anyone, to distinguish between what's propaganda, what's fake news, what's disinformation, what are the techniques that are being used.
Right. So in a way, it's not just that these people sort of grow up and are immersed in this. It's that they don't really know how to distinguish the material they're being exposed to from other more factual realities of the world, and they're sort of sucked in by, oh my gosh, is this really happening? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
There's too much disinformation
exactly.
out there?
But also it's a matter of we're all in a way also now caught up in our own echo chambers and our own filter bubbles online. So that also means that actually sometimes getting out of those filter bubbles is really helpful. That's also why I really wanted to speak to individuals on both sides of the extreme, and really was trying to establish a direct dialogue and conversation with them, because I want to understand where they're coming from. Because often I think we don't really do that we transcend these virtual boundaries that have been created in the digital space.
I sometimes think we don't transcend those boundaries in general, but we'll have to leave it at that. I have lots of questions that I feel like we could continue to talk about, but I would just going to advise listeners to read the book. That's Julia Ebner talking about her book, The Rage, The Vicious Circle of Islamist and Far-Right Extremism. Thank you, Julia, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. Then write one. Thank you to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Thanks to Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro of the Romay Foundation also for their support. You too can support us by joining our community and giving to our Patreon campaign. You just go to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and subscribe. We've got gifts for you as well. Check out our archives with over 400 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook, the Tel Aviv Review podcast, Ideas from Israel. That's the name of our page. Follow us on Twitter and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.